The forest was dark, dense, and ominous, with towering trees casting shadows in every direction. The low hum of unknown creatures stirred the air, but what drew the most attention was the giant snake slithering through the underbrush. Its massive, scaly body moved silently across the forest floor, flicking its tongue in and out, tasting the air for signs of life. Ada opened her eyes, feeling the cold, damp earth beneath her. She blinked, disoriented, as she pushed herself off the ground. The trees around her seemed to lean in menacingly, their branches like gnarled claws. Fear tightened in her chest as her gaze fell on the enormous creature sliding toward her, its thick body crushing twigs and leaves in its path. Panic surged through her. She stood up with trembling legs. Her heart raced. The snake was moving faster now, its body coiling and uncoiling with terrifying speed. Ada turned and ran, her feet pounding against the forest floor. The ground beneath her seemed uneven, almost as if it was trying to trip her. She stumbled once, but quickly regained her footing. Behind her, the sound of the snake grew louder, closer. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she ran, her eyes darting around for any escape route. Just when she thought the snake would catch up with her, a rope suddenly dropped from above. Without thinking twice, Ada grabbed onto it and began climbing as fast as she could. Her muscles burning with effort, she could hear the hiss of the snake below, snapping its jaws at her feet. But she kept climbing higher and higher. Relief started to fill her, but just as she thought she was safe, the rope snapped. Jesus! Ada snapped awake with a jolt, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. She was no longer in the forest. She was in her father's car. Her hands clutched the seat, her body tense. Her father, Onyema, glanced over at her from the driver's seat, concern written all over his face.
Adam, are you okay?
His voice was filled with worry, his eyes briefly leaving the road to focus on her. Ada blinked, her breathing still heavy as she tried to shake off the lingering terror of the dream.
I had a bad dream,
she whispered with a trembling voice. Tears welled up in her eyes as the vivid images of the snake and the forest clung to her mind like shadows. Onyema reached over, his hand resting gently on her shoulder.
It was just a dream, Ada. You're safe here with me.
He tried to smile, but even he could sense that something was wrong. The fear in her eyes was too real, too deep. Ada wiped her eyes, staring out the window. She wasn't sure why, but the dream felt different this time, as if it wasn't just a dream. Something about it felt like a warning. Before we dive into the spine-chilling tale, this is a plea to you, my amazing viewers who are yet to subscribe, to please be a part of my growth by subscribing to this channel. You can check out the description box or the icon above to see the first parts of this video. To you, my returning subscribers, thank you so much. Now, brace yourselves because what you're about to watch will leave you on the edge of your seats. The term had ended and Ada was back home, but since her return, she had been unusually quiet, spending most of her time alone in her room. The once vibrant Ada, full of energy and laughter, now seemed lost in her thoughts, her eyes distant as if haunted by something unseen. Onyema noticed the change but chose to give her space, hoping she would eventually open up. One evening, as Onyema was having dinner with his daughter, Ada pushed her food around her plate. Her mind was elsewhere. Onyema, sensing her unease, looked up from his meal and watched her closely.
Ada,
he began softly.
You haven't been yourself since you came back. What's on your mind?
Ada hesitated. She had been holding everything in, not wanting to burden her father, but she couldn't hold it anymore. She needed to talk, to tell him everything. Taking a deep breath, she put her fork down and looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Daddy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to tell you something." Onyema straightened, his concern deepening.
Go on, Ada. You can tell me anything.
While I was in school, strange things happened. I kept having dreams about snakes. There was one dream where a giant snake chased me and I was running for my life. I almost got caught, but then I woke up.
Her voice wavered as she recalled the terror.
And it's not just the dreams, Daddy. I've been seeing snakes in places they shouldn't be. It's like they're watching me, following me. A snake even turned into a student before my eyes. Daddy, I'm scared.
Onyema's face grew serious, his heart sinking as he listened to his daughter. He had hoped that whatever connection Nneka had with them was long gone, but this was too much to ignore. Ada swallowed hard, her next words even heavier.
Daddy, do you think this has something to do with Nneka?
She looked up at him, her eyes pleading for answers.
Is she still around us somehow?
Onyema sighed deeply, leaning back in his chair. He ran a hand through his hair, a troubled expression crossing his face.
Ma'am,
He began, his voice low.
I really don't know what's going on, but one thing I know is Nneka is still very much a part of our lives, in ways I can't fully explain.
Ada's heart pounded harder.
But why? Why is this happening?
Before Onyema could respond, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, making the curtains flutter as if stirred by some invisible force. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy, and a chill ran down Ada's spine. She shivered, feeling as if someone was watching them. In the shadowy depths of the snake coven, the Queen Mother stood at the center of the circle, her many-headed form towering over the snake women who gathered around her. Her eyes, glowing with fiery hatred, narrowed in fury. "Onyema!" she hissed, her voice echoing through the dark, damp chamber. "You have hurt me, not once, not twice, but this time you will pay with everything you hold dear." She slammed her tail onto the ground, causing the walls of the coven to shake. The snake women trembled, fear etched in their slithering forms as the Queen Mother's wrath boiled over. Suddenly, the Queen Mother let out a loud, eerie laugh. Her laughter echoed through the chamber, sending chills through the air. She threw her head back, her eyes glinting with malice. "I'll go myself," she declared, her voice like thunder. "I'll finish it this time." With a wave of her hand, she vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the lingering sound of her chilling laughter. By a lonely riverbank, the wind began to howl, swirling fiercely around the trees and whipping the water into a frenzy. The once calm waters now churned violently, and the sky darkened as if nature itself was recoiling from the presence of something ancient and evil. In the midst of the chaos, the Queen Mother appeared, her many-headed form towering above the river. Her eyes gleamed in the darkness as she gazed at the horizon. In a flash, her monstrous form shifted, shrinking down until she was nothing more than a middle-aged woman. "Onyema!" she rasped, her voice carrying on the wind. "You won't see this coming." She chuckled to herself before vanishing into the night, leaving only the haunting sound of her laughter echoing through the air. Onyema stood in his bedroom, pacing back and forth, unable to shake the feeling of dread that had settled deep in his chest. "How did I get into this?" he muttered under his breath, running his hand over his face in frustration. His troubles weren't over, not by a long shot, and the more he thought about it, the more helpless he felt. He couldn't protect his daughter from something he didn't understand. The fear he saw in Ada's eyes haunted him. The next morning, Onyema made up his mind. He had to seek help, real help. He called out to Ada, and together they drove to see Pastor David, hoping that the man of God could provide answers to the torments plaguing their lives. As they pulled into the driveway of the pastor's home, Onyema felt a flicker of hope, though it was quickly drowned out by the weight of everything that had happened. He led Ada inside, and after exchanging pleasantries, they sat in the pastor's modest living room. Onyema asked Ada to recount her experiences. Ada hesitated at at first, but her father's reassuring nod gave her the strength to open up. She told the pastor about the strange dreams, the snake that kept chasing her, Ogba's transformation at school, and the way she felt like something was constantly watching her, even in her waking hours. When she finished, Pastor David leaned back in his chair, his face grim.
This is serious, Onyema.
He said, his voice heavy with concern.
These spirits, they don't just follow someone without a reason. There is something more here, something deeper.
His eyes narrowed as he turned to Onyema.
What have you done?
Onyema's heart sank at the question.
I don't know.
He stammered. He racked his brain, thinking about every decision, every action that could have opened the door to such evil. Nothing made sense. Nneka, could she be the reason? But why? He couldn't piece it together. Pastor David watched him carefully.
Unless you cut off the root of this evil, it will keep coming back, Onyema.
He warned.
And next time, it could be worse.
Onyema's stomach churned.
What do we do?
He asked, his voice shaking slightly. The pastor stood up and walked over to a small shelf, pulling out a container of salt.
Take this,
he said, handing it to Onyema.
Sprinkle it at the front of all the doors in your home and at the window sills. In all you do, make sure the salt is always sprinkled at every opening in your house for 3 days.
Onyema nodded, clutching the salt tightly as if it was his last lifeline.
And there's one more thing,
Pastor David continued.
Within these 3 days, do not allow anyone into your home. I repeat, do not let anyone in, no matter who, no matter what.
Onyema swallowed hard, nodding.
I understand.
Pastor David gave them a few Bible verses, scriptures that will provide spiritual protection and guidance during this time. He placed his hand on Ada's shoulder, offering her a comforting smile.
You will be safe, my dear, but stay close to your father and keep praying.
After thanking the pastor, Onyema and Ada left, the weight of the pastor's words lingering over them like a dark cloud. Onyema's heart kept racing. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever it was, they weren't prepared for it. The moment Onyema and Ada arrived home, a woman stood at the gate waiting patiently. She had come after seeing an advert that a cleaner was needed in Onyema's house. Lost in his thoughts, Onyema drove in without even noticing her presence. Just as he and Ada were about to enter their home, Emma, his gateman, came running towards him, his voice a little breathless.
Oga, e get one woman wey dey here. She say she dey find work of maid.
Onyema paused for a brief moment, snapping back to reality.
Oh, I almost forgot I placed that advert.
He said.
Tell her to come back next week, Emma. I can't attend to that now.
Onyema hurriedly led Ada inside the house, his mind still occupied with everything Pastor David had said. Emma returned to the woman who stood by the gate watching expectantly.
Madam, Oga said make you come back next week.
Emma relayed the message. The woman's face darkened immediately. A flash of fury crossed her eyes. Emma noticed her sudden change.
Madam, hope all is well.
He asked, confused by her reaction. The woman, regaining her composure, feigned a smile. All is well, thank you. She hurriedly walked away before more could be revealed through her false demeanor. As she vanished into the streets, Emma shrugged and went back to his post. Later that night, Onyema and his daughter Ada, keeping Pastor David's instructions in mind, carefully sprinkled the salt across every door, window, and every entry point in the house. When they finished, they held hands and prayed together, seeking protection from the evil that lurked in the shadows. Once they were done praying, they went to bed, hoping for a peaceful night's rest. But peace was not in the cards. While Onyema and Ada slept, unaware of the danger outside, a large snake appeared at the back of the house. Its scales shimmered under the faint moonlight, and its piercing eyes burned with malice. It was the Queen Mother. Desperate and enraged, she flicked her tongue, tasting the air as she slittered with dark intent. However, the salt Onyema had sprinkled created an invisible barrier, keeping her from entering the house. Frustrated, the snake began to shrink, her massive body compressing into the the size of a small harmless snake, making it easier for her to find another way. The snake slithered around the house, seeking any crack or gap, but none existed. The salt had sealed off every entry point. Hissing in frustration, the snake turned toward the security house at the side of the compound where Onyema, the gateman, lived. The window of Onyema's house was slightly ajar. With a sinister flick of a tail, the snake darted through the window, winding its way into Onyema's room. He lay asleep, unaware of the creeping danger slithering towards him. Once inside, the snake transformed back into her true form, a tall, eerie woman with skin as pale as moonlight and eyes that burned with hatred. Her lips curled into a cruel smile as she looked down at Onyema's sleeping figure. "Onyema!" she shouted. "You won't see this coming." With a low, eerie laugh, the Queen Mother bent over Onyema, her eyes glowing ominously. She placed her hands on his chest. In an instant, she entered his body, her essence merging with his soul. Onyema's body jerked violently in his sleep before falling still, and then his eyes opened. They glowed with the same malevolent light that filled the Queen Mother's. He rose from his bed, now possessed by the dark force. He let out a wicked grin. Onyema jolted awake from his restless sleep, startled by a loud knock at the door. He sat up, rubbing his eyes groggily as his mind struggled to shake up the remnants of his dream. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was, but then the knock came again, more insistent this time. With a heavy sigh, Onyema got out of bed and shuffled toward the door. When he opened it, he saw Onyema, his gateman, standing there with an odd expression on his face.
"Good morning, Oga."
Onyema greeted, his voice steady but his eyes flickering with an unsettling glow.
"You been say I go help you shine your shoes today. I can't collect the shoes."
Onyema blinked, still drowsy and disoriented.
"Oh, did I say that?"
he asked, trying to recall when he had made such a request. His memory still foggy, clouded by exhaustion and the stress weighing on his mind. Onyema nodded confidently.
"Yes, Oga. You been talking."
Onyema, still half asleep and too tired to argue, waved his hand dismissively.
"All right then. Come and get them."
He turned to walk back into the house, unaware of the danger creeping closer. Onyema, now standing at the threshold, attempted to step into the house, but the moment his foot crossed the line where Onyema had sprinkled the salt, a strange and fierce fire erupted from the floor, burning his legs. A loud piercing scream tore through the early morning silence as Onyema collapsed to the ground, writhing in pain. Onyema spun around in shock, eyes wide with confusion and concern.
"Onyema, are you okay?"
he shouted, rushing toward him. Onyema was breathing heavily, his face contorted in agony.
"Oga, I know well at all. I just demanded myself,"
he said, his voice weak, but there was something strange, something dark, lingering beneath his words. Onyema, filled with sympathy and concern for his longtime gateman, bent down and patted him on the back.
"Oh, sorry, Ma. Go get some rest,"
he said, helping the man to his feet. Onyema thanked him, though his eyes gleamed with something sinister as he walked away from the house. Onyema stood at the door for a few moments, shaking his head at the oddness of the situation. His own weariness began to weigh down on him again, and he turned to head back inside. What Onyema didn't notice was that, in his rush to help Onyema, his feet had unknowingly wiped away part of the protective salt from the doorway. A small, yet crucial patch had been cleared, leaving an open passage, an entrance for the evil that was now hovering and waiting at the edge of his home. As Onyema closed the door behind him, the air around the compound shifted. Onyema, now possessed by the Snake Queen, watched and smiled darkly. Her entry was now possible. The barrier had been broken. Back inside the house, Ada sat in her room, refusing to eat. Her stomach growled from hunger, but her spirit was restless. She had been fasting and praying all day, her small frame trembling as she knelt on the floor with her Bible open before her. Something dark and ominous was closing in, and Ada felt it in her bones. She prayed fervently,
God, please protect us. I know something is wrong, but I don't know what to do. Help us, Lord.
As the day wore on, the sky darkened unexpectedly. Thick clouds gathered overhead, blotting out the sun, and a heavy wind began to blow. Trees swayed violently, their branches creaking and groaning under the force of the sudden storm. Onyema, who was sitting in the living room watching television, barely noticed the change in the weather. He had been lost in thought, his mind replaying the strange events of the morning with Ima. Then, as the wind howled outside, a sudden memory struck him. His shoes were still outside. He had left them in the sun to dry, trusting that Ima would bring them inside if needed. But knowing Ima's recent forgetfulness, he decided not to risk it. Without thinking twice, Onyema jumped up from the couch and rushed toward the door. He pulled it open hastily, and in his rush, he forgot to close it behind him as he dashed outside to retrieve his shoes. The wind seemed to grow more violent, swirling around him as if alive. The clouds churned ominously above, casting an eerie shadow over the house. Through the open door, a very slender snake slithered cautiously into the house, slipping through the broken line of salt. It moved with careful precision, avoiding any contact with the remaining salt that lingered on the floor. The moment it crossed the threshold, its body expanded grotesquely, transforming into a monstrous serpent with multiple heads. In an instant, the air inside the house grew thick with darkness, a malevolent energy swirling around like a suffocating fog. Ada, still kneeling by her bed, sensed the shift. Her eyes snapped open as a deep fear gripped her heart. Jesus, please take control, she muttered urgently under her breath, knowing something had entered the house. Ada ran toward the living room in search of her father, only to be confronted with the most horrifying sight she had ever seen. Standing in front of the living room was a monstrous multi-headed snake. Its head swayed menacingly, its scales gleamed with a dark, unnatural light, and its eyes burned with evil intent. This was beyond anything Ada had ever imagined. Even her worst nightmares had not prepared her for this. Ada let out a blood-curdling scream which echoed through the house. Outside, Onyema heard his daughter scream, and his heart dropped. Without thinking, he sprinted back toward the house, fear and panic gripping him. As he burst through the door, he was greeted by the terrifying sight of the enormous creature towering over Ada.
God, what is this?
Onyema shouted in horror. The monster lunged towards Ada with lightning speed, its head snapping viciously. Acting on pure instinct, Onyema grabbed one of his shoes and hurled it at the creature, hoping to distract it. The shoe struck one of its heads, and the monster turned with a guttural growl. In a flash, it wrapped its thick, powerful tail around Onyema's waist, lifting him off the ground effortlessly. The creature flung him across the living room with immense force, sending him crashing into a corner. Onyema's head slammed against the hard floor, and everything went black. Ada watched in horror as her father lay unconscious, but she knew she couldn't give up. Ada dashed into her room. She opened her wardrobe, frantically searching for the jar of salt Pastor David had given them. Her hands shook as she grabbed the jar. But just as she turned around, the monstrous creature crashed into her room. Its massive body filled the small space as it lunged at her, its fangs dripping venom. With terrifying speed, the creature grabbed Ada by the waist and flung her against the wall like a rag doll. Ada's head hit the tiled ground hard, pain shooting through her body. Dazed and weak, she struggled to stay conscious, but something deep inside her refused to give up. Crawling on her hands and knees, she inched toward the salt jar, her vision blurred, her body screaming in pain. Just as she reached for the jar, the monster lifted her into the air, bringing her face dangerously close to its venomous fangs. The creature's head snarled, ready to strike her down. Summoning every bit of strength she had left, Ada twisted open the jar and threw the contents directly onto the monster's face. A blood curdling screech erupted from the creature as the salt made contact with its scales. It thrashed violently, releasing Ada from its grip as it flailed around the room in agony. Ada collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The monster's massive body convulsed and trembled as its head twisted grotesquely. The salt burned through its flesh, melting the creature from the inside out. It screeched in pain, writhing in agony as it began to disintegrate. Its once terrifying form shrank, black smoke oozing from its melting body. Finally, the monster collapsed in a heap, its once towering figure reduced to nothing but a puddle of darkness. And then, in a final pitiful groan, the monster melted away completely, leaving only silence in its wake. Ada, lying motionless on the floor, stared in disbelief. She had done it. She had defeated the monster. Tears filled her eyes as exhaustion finally took over. In that moment, as the house returned to a strange calm, Ada whispered, "Thank you, Lord," and then passed out. Pastor David sat beside Onyema, whose body was covered in bandages, his face pale. The hospital room was silent except for the steady beeping of machines monitoring his condition.
Do you know who Ola is?
Pastor David's voice broke the silence, his tone firm yet compassionate. Onyema's mind, clouded by the weight of the recent events, thought for a moment before nodding slowly.
Yes, I do. What about her?
He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Pastor David's eyes narrowed, searching Onyema's face for something deeper.
What relationship did you have with her?
Onyema shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the question pressing on him. He knew there was no hiding from the truth now. Not after everything that had happened. The seriousness in Pastor David's expression made it clear that this wasn't a casual inquiry.
She was my girlfriend.
Onyema admitted, his heart sinking as the words left his mouth. Pastor David's voice grew more intense.
So, you cheated on your late wife Amara with her?
Shame washed over Onyema like a wave. He bowed his head, unable to meet the pastor's piercing gaze.
Not really. It was a one-night stand.
He muttered, the guilt heavy on his shoulders. The room grew colder as the weight of Onyema's confession filled the air. Pastor David leaned closer, his voice low but stern.
The Spirit of God revealed something to me, Onyema. Ola wasn't just the woman you had an affair with. She was the root of all this evil. She came from the snake kingdom. She killed your wife, Amara, and she would have stopped at nothing until she destroyed you completely.
Onyema's heart raced as the realization hit him like a sledgehammer. His mind reeled with shock and disbelief.
What? What are you saying, Pastor?
He stammered, his voice shaking.
I only slept with her once.
Pastor David nodded grimly.
Ola kept coming back, Onyema, first as Nneka, and then even as the girl who posed as Ogba at Ada's school. She's been haunting your life, seeking to destroy your family and soul, and yet you call that a one-night stand? You opened the door to her, and with it, you let darkness into your life. But I pray she's gone for good now, by the grace of God.
Tears streamed down Onyema's face. The enormity of what he had done, how his actions had invited evil into his home, crushed him from within. His infidelity had spiraled into something far more sinister than he could have ever imagined. His voice broke as he asked,
"Where is my daughter? Where is Ada?"
Pastor David sighed, placing a comforting hand on Onyema's shoulder. "She's in coma, Onyema. The doctors are doing everything they can, but her condition is critical." Hearing this, Onyema's heart shattered. Tears fell uncontrollably from his eyes. The image of his little girl, lying helpless in a hospital bed, was too much for him to bear. His sobs filled the room, raw and full of regrets.
A one-night stand with an unknown woman has unleashed this horror upon my family.
Onyema whispered to himself, the realization stabbing him like a knife in the chest.
I brought this upon my wife my daughter, upon myself.
The room fell into a heavy silence as Onyema lay broken in his bed. The weight of his actions pressed on him with unbearable force. Pastor David said a silent prayer, knowing that Onyema's journey to redemption would not be easy. One moment of weakness can open doors to unimaginable evil. The choices we make, especially in moments of temptation, can have devastating consequences far beyond what we see. This story serves as a reminder that betrayal, infidelity, and moral lapses do not just hurt us, they can destroy everything we hold dear. Let me know what you learned from this story in the comment section. If you enjoyed the story and would like to see more interesting and intriguing stories, please consider subscribing to this channel, not forgetting to turn on the bell notification icon so that once another video is being posted, you will be the first to be notified. You can also check out those videos here. I promise you won't be disappointed. Till we meet again in my next video, remain blessed.